All right. Well, here we go. We are embarking on our Unit 5 lecture, and today we're going to talk about transcendentalism. So, Romanticism, as we all know, is a pretty severe response or assertive response to the Enlightenment, the age of reason, rationality. Transcendentalism is more in line with Romanticism. I think as we start to look at some of the key players, Thoreau and Emerson, these American transcendentalists, is we'll refer to them. They were really romantics, but just with a little bit more American twist. So one thing that starts to happen um, during so American transcendentalism is going to, let's say, get cooking in the 1840s to 1850s, somewhere in there, and then it's really going to keep moving into the 1860s and the Civil War. But we had been American philosophy didn't really exist. 1776, 75 years prior to this, everything that the Americans were receiving, goods included, were primarily coming from these European urban centers. And they were coming across, whether they're going to South America or North America, and they were coming across. But the exact same thing was happening with philosophy and art. Philosophy and art were also coming from Europe to the Americas. And this was okay until there started to be pretty substantial cultural separation, not just economic or governmental separation, but cultural separation that took far longer in many ways than the governmental and the economic. And as this would started to occur in the early 1800s, Americans started to identify as being quite different than their European counterparts. And philosophically speaking, and artistically speaking, they were finding the same thing. And so you all watched in Unit 4 the special on the Hudson River Valley painters. And American landscape painting would come to define a whole new level of artistic expression in the American creative ethos. And we're going to start to see the exact same thing with philosophy and literature. And transcendentalism is going to be a major component here of that loss of transatlanticism. So this trade was called transatlanticism. And so the transatlantic trade would start to be philosophically and artistically would start to be removed, and we'd now have a wholly American philosophy. Now, granted, in this first iteration, that's somewhat limited because we were basically recreating or rebranding Romanticism in many ways. So you can see transcendentalism as sort of the next step in the development of romantic philosophy. So that's where we're going here. So let's take a look at the characteristics. I think you all should have picked up on some of these characteristics as you were watching the Thoreau and the Emerson uh, little documentary, historical, biographical pieces. But slightly different than romantic philosophy, transcendental philosophy was very centered around personal self-reliance, social reform, individuality, physical simplicity, living a very simple, pure life. A lot of these transcendentalists, the philosophers themselves, would come from a long tradition of European or New England Puritanism, which was, very pure, very simple people. And so there was a continuation from that Puritan ethos of an anti-materialism ethic, in that material was not the things that would make you happy. Instead, what would make you happy was getting closer to God. And how would you get closer to God or to the divine? Well, there was one primary way, and that was nature. And so it wasn't material that would make you happy, but spending time working on your individuality, your simplicity, your self reliance, and doing that while you were in nature. So, like the Romantics, they placed a high value on intuition, but even more so than the Romantics, they really placed a lot of value in nonconformity. They did not believe that you should simply and blindly follow the conventions of society. Instead, you should be constantly questioning progress. You should constantly be questioning science. You should constantly be questioning cultural conformity to anything whatsoever. And so they were real rebels in this way. And so moving ahead here, we can see how these values, so as we study these philosophical eras that are really impactful, in my opinion, to our environmental perspective or environmental imagination, again, for lack of a better term, we have to understand how each of these philosophies impact American values at that particular time and that particular place in a historical context. And if you look at the the entire transcendental movement, it was a very historically well placed movement because it dovetailed with what a lot of Americans sort of needed in order to face the challenges that were before them. There was a really large push after the Louisiana Purchase for westward expansion. There was a lot of the Homestead Act and a lot of opportunity for people to go out and settle homesteads in the western frontier, which, early on, the western frontier would be Pennsylvania and Ohio, and then eventually Iowa and the Great Plains. And then it would lead much further into the American Rockies, and then finally, obviously, the West Coast. But for that entire duration of American history, the attributes that were supported, cultural attributes that were supported by transcendentalism, were really helpful attributes for Americans to identify with. And these would be those impacts of self-reliance, individuality, spiritual connection to nature. Because if you were going to head west, you were going to be in nature all the time. You were not going to be spending your time in urban environments. And then obviously relying on your intuition, trusting your instincts, all of these things, some of these core elements of transcendentalism would be massively helpful. So, Unit 4, I had you read The Last American Man. And as you can see, I just want to point out this one section, and we're going to start right here. Unhindered by class restrictions, bureaucracy, or urban squalor, all of those things that the Romantics and the transcendentalists were pushing against, so rules and laws, nonconformity, bureaucracy, government, and urban squalor, the consequences of rationalism. These Americans simply got more done in a single day than anyone had imagined possible. That was the bottom line. Nobody could believe how fast these guys worked. German-born Godfrey Duden, who traveled to the West in 1824 to identify suitable homesteads for German families interested in immigrating to America, reported home in wonder. In North America, construction jobs, which the European countries do not accomplish in centuries, are completed in a few years through the voluntary cooperation of individual citizens. And so this is that individuality. At the time, obviously, working together collectively for a task, but it's that the individual comes before whatever the collective happens to be. At the time of Duden's visit, for instance, the farmers of Ohio were busy constructing a 230-mile-long canal without the help of a single licensed engineer. Again, self-reliance. If you don't have an engineer around, what do? Well, you still build the canal. And that's what they did. Duden saw beautiful cities thriving where not even towns had stood 2 years before. He saw new roads, new bridges, thousands of new farms, and 100 more steamships, all new, handmade, ingeniously designed, and perfectly operative. Did the American man need something done? Well, then, he simply made it happen. So I'm sure this is a romantic or romanticized view of, American independence, self-reliance, individuality, all of those sorts of things. But whether or not those things were true, those were part of the American imagination. And those were important parts of the American imagination at that time. And I think they continue to be very influential today, as I'll show here in this next slide, or in actually 2 slides from now. But first, let's go ahead and look at, what were some of the quotes? What were some of the things spinning out of these transcendentalists? Thoreau and Emerson were by no means the only transcendentalists. They're kind of the 2 most iconic. Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau would end up being the poster children for American transcendentalism. But American transcendentalism is going to sink its teeth, or its roots, we should say, into American philosophy, and by many accounts will be, as I already mentioned, the basis of the first whole American philosophy that's not based on a transatlantic tradition, even though it kind of is. So anyways, a couple key ideas in transcendentalism: self-reliance and individualism must outweigh external authority and blind conformity to custom and tradition. And so these guys were pretty interested in busting up custom and tradition, especially where they couldn't see the purpose. Spontaneous feelings and intuition are superior to deliberate intellectualism and rationality. So again, that beating up on intellectualism and rationality. So one of the reasons that we see in transcendentalism this rejection of custom and tradition is because many of those customs and traditions up until this point had very European roots, and Americans were looking for their own identity, their own take on the world, their own perspective based on their own experiences. And this was very different than the European traditions and customs. And so they were looking to break some of those. Not everyone was. I mean, this would obviously rattle the cages culturally for many folks, but typically contemporary philosophies for any given period or time or people rattle cages. So here we go. We can see Henry David Thoreau: under government which imprisons or unjustly, under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is in prison. And so this is when Henry David Thoreau ended up going to prison because he didn't want to pay his taxes because of the Mexican-American War. He didn't believe in the Mexican-American War. He didn't believe it was just. So it's a very token event in the grand history, of imprisonments. He went to, I think, prison for one night in his local town prison. But it was a pretty, historically speaking, as we look back, it's gained a lot of attention, and not because of the severity of his prison sentence, but because of the philosophy that he espoused. And for those of you, some of you may know, but Mahatma Gandhi, would read Henry David Thoreau's perspective on civil disobedience, and he would use that as a philosophical model to overthrow the British in India. And then again, that would be picked up also by Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement in the 1960s, is that the philosophy of Henry David Thoreau notions of civil disobedience would guide the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So obviously, across the world, this new philosophy over justice, what's fair, what's right, how do you respond to a government who isn't using justice effectively, is all of this is based on Henry David Thoreau's early writings. And so down here we see another one from him: disobedience is the true foundation of liberty. The obedient must be slaves. And so he's saying that obviously you must be constantly disobedient. Obviously he's a rabble rouser. He's a bit of a troublemaker. Philosophically speaking, less so in real life, but he, I think, truly believed in what he would say. And so he went to Walden, and I think some of you maybe have bumped into or read excerpts of Walden. Walden was a pond, small pond, on Emerson's property where Henry David Thoreau would live in a tiny cabin. And he said in his rationale at the time, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and to see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. So here, two things that he believed were necessary for authentic life was simplicity, a very simple life, very austere, a one room, very small cabin on the lake, a simple life, free from society, to break away from society and the shackles of society. And then obviously that it was all based on the essential facts of life. The importance of life was all based on a personal experience or a personal relationship with nature. And by obtaining those things, one could become spiritually and philosophically enlightened. And that enlightenment would lead to greater freedom and self knowledge. And so I run out of room here, but self knowledge. So to this day, when people go and spend time in wilderness, it's often viewed, even around here, even in our contemporary society, this experience with nature is viewed as this sort of cleansing um, notion. This is where a person learns about themselves. And I'm not saying that's not accurate or true, but at the same time, this comes from a long philosophical tradition within American philosophy. We didn't just make this up ourselves. So, Emerson, quote from Emerson here, there is a time and there is a time in every man's education when he arrives at the conviction that envy is ignorance, that imitation is suicide, that he must take himself, for better or worse, as his portion. And so the transcendentalists did not believe you should copy your neighbor, that you shouldn't keep up with the Joneses. You needed to be yourself. And that was the only way that you could truly and authentically live. And so imitation is suicide, envy is ignorance is a pretty famous quote, all coming from Emerson, coming from the transcendental movement that we're building upon here. So next thing I want to look at is a couple of modern political, so seeing how this applies to today. I've taken full classes on transcendentalism, and transcendentalism is often regarded as the not the only instigator, but the one of the philosophical backbones of the radical environmental movement of today, and also libertarianism. And as you can see, both of these have sort of taken some of the highlights and pulled them into their own constructs. And so one of those is obviously for the radical environmental movement, which this is precursor for where we're going in our text, in our book, Overstory. Prioritization of nature over society, that nature is more important than society. And here also the next one is that nature is a part of the divine. Nature is part of or the work of God, and should therefore be seen any experience with nature as this sort of spiritual experience. And then additionally, civil disobedience. If you believe that someone shouldn't be cutting down a tree, well, you don't go out and try to shoot those people. You simply climb up into the tree and make it impossible for that person to, or that economic interest to cut that tree down. Another front, quite different in many ways, but libertarianism, which is obviously based on the notion of liberty and of freedom. And they have a lot of a libertarian political perspective, puts a lot of priority on the individual and the responsibility and the decisions of the individual, on self-reliance and not trusting government organizations or large structures, but just trusting yourself to make the best decision. And then a pretty severe mistrust of government regulation or government interventionism. So both of these do find some roots within transcendentalism. And you could look into this further, but there's a lot of discussion of this in various places. All right. So wrapping up here, I just want to play a little song for you. Eddie Vedder. I don't know how many of you know John Krakauer, pretty well-known author, writes nonfiction. He wrote Into the Wild, and here's a little synopsis of the book. In April 1992, a young man from a well-to-do family hitchhiked to Alaska and walked alone into the wilderness north of Mount McKinley. His name is Christopher Johnson McCandless. He had given $25,000 in savings to charity, abandoned his car and most of his possessions, burned all of the cash in his wallet, invented a new life for himself. 4 months later, his decomposed body was found by moose hunters. And so I've taught this book, I've studied this book for a number of years, but Christopher McCandless was very much emulating a transcendental philosophy or a transcendental perspective on life, burning his cash, escaping society in the clutches of imitation, and heading out to find the spiritual enlightenment or growth or autonomy, all of the things that transcendentalists, philosophically position. Unfortunately, it didn't go so well for him. But this got turned into a pretty well-known movie, and here's the cover for the movie, Into the Wild. If you haven't seen it, highly encourage you. In fact, I've even considered using it in this class, but I highly encourage you to check it out. Here's a quote from the book. It should not be denied that being footloose has always exhilarated us. It is associated in our minds with escape from history and oppression and law and irksome obligations, absolute freedom. And the road has always led west. So I'm now going to play this Eddie Vedder song for you. I'll leave the lyrics up here.
It's a mystery to me. We have agreed with which we have agreed. And you think you have to want more than you need. Until you have it all, you won't be free. Society, you're a crazy breed. I hope you're not lonely without me. When you want more than you have, you think you need. And when you think more than you want, your thoughts begin to bleed. I think I need to find a bigger place. 'Cause when you have more than you think, you need more space. Society, you're a crazy breed. I hope you're not lonely without me. Society, crazy indeed. I hope you're not lonely without me. There's those thinking more, less is more. But if less is more, how you keeping score? It means for every point you make, your level drops. Kinda like you're starting from the top, and you can't do that. Society, you're a crazy breed. I hope you're not lonely without me. society. Crazy indeed. I hope you're not lonely without me. Society, have mercy on me. I hope you're not angry if I disagree. Society, crazy indeed. I hope you're not lonely without me.
All right. So, as you can see here, I think you're all pretty capable of going through and analyzing these lyrics and looking at how, freedom, individuality, a lack of materialism, when you want more than you have, you think you need, when you think more than you want, your thoughts begin to bleed. Finding a bigger place, I mean, the outdoors. You can go through and analyze that on your own. But that's a brief overview of transcendentalism. Let me know, as always, if you have any questions. Until then, I'll see you all in our next unit.